Okay, so we've talked about separating the three powers: the legislative power, the executive power, and the judicial power, and this creates a rule of law where the law is the highest authority. And in this way, the power doesn't get abused. We don't get this feeling that the will of the people suddenly becomes not so important, and those with the power suddenly put their interests first. So with the separation of powers, you can have checks and balances where powers control each other and keep each other in limits. But separating these powers does create a problem, or three problems in fact. So first problem is there are always tensions between the powers, between the different bodies. So you've got tensions between the magistrates and the political power. When the political power gets out of its limits, the magistrates can come in and say that's unconstitutional, or that you can't do that, etc. That's breaking the law, and vice versa. The politicians can accuse the judges, or maybe there's tensions between the government. So we do, in a situation where you've got different powers, you're going to have tensions. Another problem is which bodies should be directly elected by the people. Remember, if the power originally belongs to the people, the sovranità appartiene al popolo. When they vote, they give that power. So if it's directly elected, whoever receives that vote has a lot of power. They've got a mandate. The indirectly elected, we mean, for example, the President of the Republic is not directly elected by the Italian people. He's elected by the Parliament, so he's got an election, but it's indirect, so he will have less power. He is considered less, shall we say, influential on the direction of the country, because he's not directly elected. So, that's got to be decided. Who has this direct election and so has a bigger voice? And so how to recognise, if there are tensions, how do we reconcile the need for plurality of powers? So we need to separate the powers and create the tensions, but we also need political unity of the state. The state must do big things, and sometimes in an emergency, for example, with coronavirus, we need unity. We now have a government of national unity where we have one single very small party outside the government. So there is this need for unity, even in normal times. We need a certain amount of unity to make changes, to agree on what direction to go. Otherwise, we don't go in any direction. So the state needs a certain amount of political unity to take us to the place where we need to go, help us progress and react. And maybe we do need big changes sometimes, reforms, but we need this plurality of power. It's difficult to achieve. We've got three solutions on how to resolve these problems. How we resolve these problems. First of all, these solutions are not to do with the judicial power, which is always independent. The solutions, so it's always very separate. But the solutions are to do with the configuration of the executive and legislative powers, how they are configured, who has them, and who controls who. They are kept separate, but there are three different different configurations. We've got a presidential government, which is one configuration, a parliamentary government, which is another, and a semi-presidential government, which is the third. We'll look first of all at the presidential government. This isn't in Italy, this is enacted in America, in the USA. So the people elect directly the president and the parliament. In an election, they have two votes. They can choose the president. Last time it was between Biden and Trump, and they chose Biden, but also who they want sitting in the parliament to be their representative. Because the president is elected directly, he has a lot of power. He's not considered a little bit, like in Italy, the president is less influential, shall we say. He actually has a lot of power. He has the executive power. He nominates the ministers, so they are an extension of him, because he can also unnominate them. He controls them. They don't have so much power. They just do what he wants. And he has the executive power, which means he enacts the law. He enacts the law. He applies the law. But they also elect the parliament, which obviously has a lot of power then, and that has the legislative power, so it makes the law. The president is not dependent on the parliament and vice versa, because they are both directly elected, so one cannot control the other. It can get blocked, for example, if the parliament makes the financial law, the budget, and the president doesn't agree with it, it's blocked. It means they can't do anything. Sometimes that happens. The parliament wants to borrow a lot of money and the president says no, and then the budget can't be done, and sometimes that even shuts down government. It blocks, it means the government can't pay for any police officers' wages, etc., or any state wages, etc. So it can get blocked, but there's no crisis in terms of the government falling, or the president falling, or the parliament becoming dissolved. So it's got that stability. It keeps going for 5 years, but it can get blocked. But we do find the president, as he is a single person invested in him, is a lot of power. We do find that there can be, it is a system where big changes can happen, that normally the executive power can initiate a lot of laws and have a program that can be carried out, and there's one person independently deciding this, having a program and really pushing for the changes he wants. So normally it's one person. That means there can be big changes, because you don't have so much tensions in government. In the Italian system, it's different. Normally you have a collegial style government where, if things are not agreed in government, the government can collapse. There's often a coalition in government, and governments can collapse, and big changes, very big changes, like in America, are not proposed, because they've got to keep everyone happy. So this is the system of America, and the characteristics are, it can produce big change. The government can be blocked, but it can't. It's very stable. There's no crisis where Parliament, the government can fall, and maybe you need a new election because you can't find another coalition, etc., etc. More stable. Okay, so the semi-presidential government is acting in France, is operational in France. Here, there's again the President and the Parliament are directly elected by the people, but the government is indirectly elected. It's nominated by the President, and the Parliament must give its trust, its confidence. There is a confidence vote in the government. So the government really depends on the Parliament for its continuation. So there's a little bit more power for the Parliament and a bit less for the President. Although the President of France has a lot of power, because he's got again the executive power, and he's directly elected, so he can't be removed. There's no crisis. But the Parliament is also directly elected, so it has the legislative power and also doesn't depend on, but they both depend on each other to cooperate to create the government. So it's a bit in between this. You've got two very big, quite separate powers, quite separate in this case, depending on each other to operate the government and keep the law being applied in the correct way. So that's in France. Right, in the parliamentary democracy, which is in Italy and in England, the electorate votes for the Parliament, which has the executive power, and the Parliament chooses the government. In Italy, the Parliament proposes the government. They propose, the different parliamentary groups propose, and the President of the Republic nominates the government. So really it's his choice, and it really is. And there was a case where you had the Lega Nord proposing an economics minister who didn't believe in the euro, or written a book against the euro, Italy being the euro, and the President of the Republic, Mattarella, said no, he can't be the minister. So he really does nominate the government, but the government must have the confidence of the Parliament. So the Parliament can control the government, always, any time. The government can have a vote of no confidence on the government, and it can fall. So there can be a crisis in government. The government, any coalition of government, coalition we mean lots of parties being in the same government, like Lega Nord with Cinque Stelle, and if Parliament doesn't want this government, remember the government has got the executive power, but also the power to create a programme. Normally they have the programme and they initiate laws. They have a lot of initiative of laws, and if they're not, the Parliament are not happy with that government and that the way, the direction it's leading, the government leads the country with this programme. If it's not happy, it can vote to collapse, to dissolve the government. So the government really are controlled. So these powers, the executive and legislative power in the parliamentary democracy, are quite mixed, are not so separate. They're separate. We've got one called the government, one called Parliament. They do separate roles. But the Parliament really controls the government, so they're not so separate. There might not be so much tension because the government will take into account what the Parliament wants. It will always always try and consider what the Parliament wants, there will be less leadership. Like I said, in the presidential government, you've got a bit more change, you've got more leadership by one person. Here, the government are collegiale, so they work in a collegial way and lead the country, but they do need the government, the Parliament, to trust them. You've got a separate, in this system, you've got a separate head of state. Head of state in this system is in England, you've got the Queen, and they're a little bit outside the system. Because they're not directly elected by the people, they're a bit super parts. So the Queen of England is kind of has the sovereignty invested in her, according to our unwritten constitution. She is sovereign. She is the sovereign, invested by tradition. But she's not elected, so really she doesn't get involved. She just stays above. She's the head of state, so she's the commander-in-chief. Remember, if you've got all the state, you're the boss, you're the commander-in-chief of the army. So she's got a lot of influence there, really, in an unofficial way. Remember, England is less clear. There's no written constitution. It's all very grey area and unclear, and what's not said happens often. In Italy, the head of state has a clear role written in the constitution. We'll look at that later. The president of the republic is the head of state. He's not voted by the people, so he doesn't have much power. He's kind of super parts, a bit outside the system. Again, head of state, he's commander-in-chief of the army. He does have an influence. He's a guarantor that the system's working according to the constitution. He can maybe question things and give advice to the parliament when he thinks it's necessary. You know, he's quite an old, wise, experienced person normally. The minimum age is quite high. And so he should have a lot of wisdom and be able to act in a kind of super parts way. You know, they have this possibility of even letting people out of prison, etc. And the pardoning criminals. America's the same. In America, you've got the president as the head of state, and he is directly elected. So he's the commander-in-chief of the army, and he can pardon people, and he represents the country abroad, etc. But he's not super parts. He's actually in the system. But again, he can pardon people like other heads of state. Heads of state normally represent the unity of the nation too, the unity of the state and the nation, and they, you know, go and do the big meetings abroad to represent Italy or maybe America, important meetings. Even those in Italy, it would be those with a lot of power, like the Prime Minister of Italy would go to the G20 or G7, not the President of the Republic. So there's that difference.